Now, our next speaker is Patricia Harries, who's giving a 30-minute talk in Strand 1 on behalf of ELT consultants. Patricia is a teacher and teacher trainer based in Colombo, Sri Lanka. She has recently co-authored an introduction to evidence-based teaching in the English language classroom with Carol Lethaby and Russell Mayne. During Patricia's talk, we recommend watching in speaker view, and if you have any questions, please type them in the Q&A box. Take it away, Patricia. Please share your screen.
Hello, everybody. Hi, everyone. Can you see my screen? Yes? Good. Okay, I can see lots of yeses. All right, so let's start. So thank you for the introduction. So I'm Patty Harries, and I'm pleased to be representing ELT Consultants today, and would like to thank Wendy Arnold and ELT Consultants for giving me the opportunity to give this talk, the title of which is Evidence-Based Teaching: How Research Findings Can Help Us Teach. So the first question you might be asking yourself is, what is evidence-based teaching? Well, basically, it means looking at research and evidence to help inform what you do in the classroom. We, that is my friend and colleague Carol Lethaby and I, have been interested in this area for a few years now. And as was said, we've actually published an introduction to evidence-based teaching this year with our colleague Russell Mayne. So this is our definition. We argue that it's not about turning teaching into an exact science. There are so many variables involved, but using evidence to inform and guide us together with context and experience. Why do we need evidence-based teaching? Well, as Pashla and colleagues put it, our intuitions and beliefs about how we learn are often wrong in serious ways. This is why we need to consider what research can show us. Where can the evidence come from? Of course, research into second language acquisition is an important field for us. And no doubt there will be findings discussed in this session that are also being investigated by researchers of second language acquisition. But for today's talk, we're going to look beyond our field. So in the last couple of decades in mainstream education, there have been efforts to consider classroom practice in scientific terms. And this has resulted in what's been called the science of learning. It's not a single model, but draws upon a range of insights about learning from fields such as neuroscience and cognitive science and psychology, fields that provide evidence derived from the scientific method. And we're going to look at evidence from these today. There are three main reasons why it could be a good idea as teachers of English language to know about research and evidence from these fields. We may be using strategies that evidence shows are not really effective. We may be underusing strategies that have been shown to be effective. And of course, research can validate good classroom practice that we're implementing. So we're going to spend the rest of the talk focusing on these 3 points by looking at a couple of findings from neuroscience and 2 pairs of connected ideas from cognitive science and psychology. So since the 1990s, with the advent of fMRI, that's functional magnetic resonance imaging, Neuroscientists have been able to see the physical brain in action and see how different parts of the brain are activated when we do different tasks. This has helped to identify and challenge what are known as neuromyths. These are popular but mistaken ideas about the workings of the brain. And new findings have helped to validate or refute classroom practice based on how the brain works. An example of a neuromyth is that learning is enhanced if people are classified and taught according to their preferred learning style. This idea of assessing and accommodating learning styles in the classroom continues to hold currency amongst English language teachers around the world. And usually learners are categorized into one of three preferred styles: visual, auditory, kinesthetic. This misconception is based on valid research. That is that visual, auditory, and kinesthetic information is processed in different parts of the brain. However, neuroscience has shown that there is profound cross-modal activation and transfer of information between sensory modalities. Therefore, it is incorrect to assume that only one sensory modality is involved with information processing. So that is looking at what goes on in the brain. Neuro and cognitive scientists with an interest in what goes on in the classroom have conducted research with learners on whether teaching to a preferred learning style benefits learning. This is known as the meshing hypothesis. A landmark study was published in 2015 by Rogowski et al. It investigated the meshing hypothesis directly. So again, that's the idea that learning can be enhanced by teaching to a learner's preferred learning style. The study was done using so-called visual and auditory adult learners, and they found no evidence to support the meshing hypothesis. In 2020, Rogowski and colleagues published their paper in which they describe using the same design and methodology, for this time a study on young learners, so 10 to 11-year-olds. These students were given reading comprehension and listening comprehension tasks, and then their preferred learning style was assessed. Now, according to the meshing hypothesis, the visual learners should have done better at the reading tasks and the auditory learners at the listening. But in fact, visual learners did better in both. And the conclusion was the same. Results failed to find a significant relationship between auditory or visual learning style preference and comprehension. And as Rogowski and her team write, matching instruction to meet a student's auditory or visual learning style had no effect on student achievement. So we can see from these findings that the study of the brain by neuroscientists has been supported by classroom research to indicate that as teachers, we don't need to spend time assessing and accommodating our learners' so-called learning styles. But while we're on the subject of different modalities, here's some neuroscientific research that supports something you've probably been implementing with your young learners all along, and that's the use of movement when learning. Two recent studies, Macedonia et al. And Matthias et al., using fMRI and something called transcranial magnetic stimulation, have found that learning foreign language vocabulary with gestures is more effective than just learning through audiovisual modes. And Oakley et al., having examined these findings, explain meaningful gestures lead to deeper encoding, stronger, better neural connections of the new word. So that's a very brief look at how evidence from neuroscience can inform what we do in practice. Let's now move on to the areas of cognitive science and psychology. So if neuroscience looks at the physical workings of the brain, cognitive science and psychology tell us more about the mind and thinking. Let's consider some evidence from these fields that might help our teaching and the learner's learning. And we'll begin with the role of one type of memory important for classroom learning, and then look at the importance of prior knowledge. So, working memory is the memory system where small amounts of information are stored for a very short duration. Working memory roughly equates with what we are conscious of at any one time. And it's limited, and we've known this for a long time, going back to Miller, an American cognitive psychologist in the 1950s. What this means in practice is that we can't try to give learners too much new information at one time to process, or they will experience cognitive overload and forget it or learn it inaccurately. So as teachers of young learners, we will know that the capacity of working memory increases with age. The average 4-year-old has about half the capacity of the average 14-year-old, who should have the same capacity as an adult. And of course, there is variation within a class. Some pupils will have less capacity, some more than average. So we will need to differentiate with this in mind. So as we saw, the working memory is limited. So as English language teachers, we might be thinking, so how many new vocabulary items can I introduce in a lesson? Well, Miller, the cognitive psychologist I mentioned with the last slide, famously gave us the number 7 plus or minus 2. That's 7 items of new information being all an average adult can process at one time. And in the language classroom, this was equated to 7 new words. But more recent research is saying we can only process 4 items if they're unfamiliar. So that's very few. Long-term memory, on the other hand, has no known limits. It's the memory system where large amounts of information are processed and stored. Clark et al. Called the long-term memory a big mental warehouse for storing words, people's faces, philosophical ideas, skateboard tricks. So learning is about creating links in the long-term memory, which leads us to the questions: how is the information stored? And how can we get the new information into the long-term memory and create those links? When we get new information into the long-term memory, i.e. we learn things, we don't just store the information willy-nilly. There's a system for organizing and storing related knowledge known as schemas. Having good knowledge schemas helps to reduce working memory load. This is because although there are a limited number of elements that can be held in the working memory at one time, a schema constitutes only a single element in the working memory. Sweller et al. Say a high-level schema can effectively bypass the limits of working memory. So it's essential then that learners have good knowledge schemas, so they can use old information to help process new information and integrate new information into existing schema. And this brings us on to prior knowledge. Schemas are the quintessential form of prior knowledge, say Oakley et al. And research has shown that the level of prior knowledge makes a difference to learner outcomes. Marzano reports that the average correlation between background knowledge and achievement is 0.66. This means that students who have a lot of background knowledge on a topic will learn readily and well, while students who do not have good background knowledge will not learn as well. So what prior knowledge do our learners have? Well, they have content knowledge, which is world knowledge. They have an implicit knowledge of their first language and some knowledge of the second language. So a few ideas of what we can do in the classroom to exploit this. Well, we could use references to the background and culture of the student and try to make connections with what we're doing in the classroom to their lives. We can exploit cross-curricular connections. So if we have a reading text about sharks and the The pupils have been looking at sharks in another class. At school, we can find out what they've learned about where sharks live, what they eat, etc. Pull that out of them. We can help students to notice similarities and differences between the first and second language. So, for example, vocabulary cognates. And of course, discussions like this can take place in the mother tongue. And we can build on what learners already know about the second language. So, for example, words and expressions in English from songs and popular culture. Interestingly, Nation has suggested that learners need to know approximately 98% of the words in written or spoken discourse in order to understand it well. And this suggests that we need to make sure that as teachers, we focus more on pre-reading and pre-listening language work for lower level learners, rather than content work, perhaps. So when teaching and learning, we want to move the new information from the working memory into the long-term memory, and then of course later to get it out again. And we can do this by providing lots of active practice to consolidate new learning and promote automaticity, ensuring the brain strengthens new neural links in the long-term memory. So let's look at two strategies that have been shown by research to make this happen: spaced retrieval practice and practice testing. Okay, just spend a few seconds having a look at this slide. So who amongst us hasn't done this? And by this, I mean the second picture. So through cramming or massed practice, as it's known, you'll remember the content for the exam if you can stay awake in it, but it's forgotten pretty quickly afterwards. If we're aiming for deeper learning, we need to implement spaced or distributed practice. And this is simply spreading out practice or revision sessions over a period of time. We know this is much more effective because there is a huge volume of research that shows that it leads to much greater long-term retention. This is a picture of Ebbinghaus, an experimental psychologist, who in the 19th century published his work on spaced practice and memory. It was published in 1885. And the effects identified in his work have been replicated in laboratories and classrooms with adults and young learners in a variety of subjects in hundreds of studies ever since. Researchers believe that spaced retrieval practice works because it allows time for the learner to forget what was practiced previously. And it's believed that the closer you are to forgetting, the more likely you will benefit from revisiting it. It makes it difficult to bring that previously studied content to mind, and this is known as a desirable difficulty. And re-encountering the information boosts its storage strength in the long-term memory. There have been many studies done on spaced practice and the learning of vocabulary, first language vocabulary, second language vocabulary, and even vocabulary from artificial languages. And the studies have mostly been done with adults. But let's look at a couple of recent studies involving young learners. So Sobel et al. Published a study in 2011, which was done with a class of 10-year-olds, and they were learning English, first language, unfamiliar words. And one group was taught the words and practiced them on the same day. And a second group was taught the words, and then they were given a week's gap, and then they practiced the words after a week. And then 5 weeks later, both groups were given a test. And the group that had the spaced conditions, had that 1 week gap, did better in the test. It showed that they could retain the words better. Now, Lahi and Salehi did a very similar study on second language vocabulary with 7 to 11-year-olds who were looking at English Farsi word pairs. So the same method, one group taught and practiced on the same day, another group was taught the word pairs and they revisited those word pairs and practiced them a week later. And once again, the group that had that spaced condition did much better in the test, subsequent test. So that's vocabulary. Kasprowitz et al. Did a study recently on second language learners, young learners. So these were 8 to 11-year-olds who were English learners learning French. And this was done on grammar, so verb conjugation. And what they were actually interested in was looking at this space between the two practice sessions. So they had one group who were practicing after a gap of 3.5 days, and another group were practicing after a gap of 7 days. And of course, they had a group that just learned and practiced on the same day. Now, interestingly, that there were minimal differences in outcomes between the three groups when they were subsequently tested. And this mirrors the small amount of research that's been done into spaced practice for learning second language grammar with adults. It's yielded mixed results. So it's interesting to see that possibly how different the learning of grammar is to the learning of vocabulary. And of course, it points to the need for more research. Okay, the second strategy that we can employ to help consolidate new learning and promote automaticity is practice testing. And we're talking about informal mini classroom tests. They're often known as low stakes or no stakes tests, which means that the results of these tests contribute very little or not at all to any final grade. Also known as classroom quizzing in the States. And these tests can be implemented by the teacher, but it also refers to self-testing or the kind of testing that you might do with a partner when you test each other. So you should be already seeing a link with spaced retrieval practice that we've just talked about. And another thing they have in common is that the testing effect has a long history behind it. The first well-known study published in 1909 was done on college students in the USA, and it found that practice testing enhances long-term retention and slows down the process of forgetting. Yang et al. This year published a huge meta-analysis on 222 studies done in the classroom on the use of practice testing. So that's the data of over 50,000 students, 40% of which were school-aged learners. And they conclude from the results of these studies that testing is a learning tool, not simply an assessment technique. So the mechanisms behind the testing effect are clearly similar to what we saw for spaced retrieval practice. Weinstein and Sumeraki write, every time a memory is brought to mind, it is reconstructed and reinforced. When students take a quiz, they're not just checking their memory, they are enhancing it. So it's the act of retrieval in the testing that's connecting, strengthening, and extending these neural links in the long-term memory. So again, there have been lots of studies that point to the advantage of practice testing in the learning of vocabulary. However, most of these studies have been done on college-age students, and less is known about the testing effect with young learners of language. Let's have a look at Karpik et al. Here in 2016. This was a study done with 10-year-old or a mean age of 10-year-old children. And again, first language this time, learning unfamiliar words. So a group of learners were asked to restudy these unfamiliar words simply by rereading them. And another group was given little mini retrieval test tasks using cues to try to get them to retrieve the words rather than just read them. All the children took a final test, and then the children who had those test-like retrieval tasks performed better than those who simply restudied. Nakata et al., this is a recent one here in Japan, was looking at Japanese learners of English. Now, actually, what they were interested in was looking at whether weekly quizzes that were done just on the content of that week, how that compared with weekly quizzes of the vocabulary that were done on vocabulary that had been learnt in previous weeks as well as that week. So cumulatively. And they found that the group that had the cumulative quizzing, so the words that were not just taught that week, but were brought in for the test from previous weeks, did better in a final test at the end of the vocabulary. So I think this is quite an interesting study because obviously students there have benefited from the spacing strategy and also from interleaving, which is this idea that you're bringing in content, other content and mixing up the content. So I think that's quite an interesting one for us to think about for our young learner classroom. Okay, well, of course, as teachers, if we implement practice testing in class, we observe that there are indirect benefits to this. And it's good to see what we observe in class borne out by the research. So Roediger et al. In this paper were able to show that students who study, who have practice tests in their course, study more often, for longer, and more consistently. Another benefit of practice testing is that it seems to help learners to learn more from their future study. This is a phenomenon known as test potentiated learning. And this is, of course, because the test shows students what they have not learned well. And as a result, they can carry out so-called selective restudy. That is, they focus on the material they don't know well. And then, in addition, frequent quizzing also appears to benefit students by reducing test anxiety. Now, Agarwal et al. Surveyed over, I think it's 1,408 middle and high school students who had all experienced classroom-based practice testing. And the key findings from their survey were that, well, firstly, 92% of those surveyed said that they thought that practice testing was beneficial. And 72% of these young learners said that frequent practice tests helped them feel less nervous about exams. So space retrieval practice and practice testing. Are we implementing this in our classrooms? We probably would say that we do review and recycle, but how much do we really do when we're under pressure to work through a syllabus? Can we perhaps start a lesson with a short review of something that was studied last week, not the last class, but last week or last month? Can we break up instruction for retrieval practice? So you'll probably know about that technique of think, write, pair, share. So stopping and asking students to get into pairs after they've had a think and perhaps written some notes to retrieve something that's just been taught. Can we incorporate more testing of partners in pair practice or teach your partner something? How often do we repeat the same activities after feedback? Homework obviously naturally allows for spaced practice, but perhaps we shouldn't just be giving homework that's looking at what the students have done that day, but rather bringing in material from previous lessons a week ago or a month ago that they can work on for homework. And of course, many young learners don't understand how to learn. So we perhaps need to teach them explicitly about how the memory works and about practice strategies. I'm sure you're familiar with the very low-tech vocabulary word card strategy, where on the card you've got the word on one side and on the other side you've got a translation or a picture, and the learners are supposed to look and then try to think of what the answer is before they turn the card over. This is something we can teach learners to do. We want to make sure that they are actually retrieving and not peeping. And of course, that they're doing it a few times before they discard the card and think that they know it. And of course, there are apps that do this and algorithms that build in spacing and interleaving. Other simple things to do are to get students simply to close their books, not to look at their books when they're trying to produce the language in practice, or to look away from their books. I think sometimes we need to erase our boards because we might have language on the boards that the students are looking at when really they ought to be trying to retrieve that language. Obviously, we want them not to go immediately to a verb list when they're doing a close exercise, a gap fill exercise, not to immediately turn to a dictionary or to Google Translate. Now, of course, learners don't always appreciate this because it's more difficult. So we need to tell them about the concept of desirable difficulties. And because they're young learners, we probably need to do some parental training as well.
Oh, thank you so much.
So to recap.
Thank you so much, Patricia. I'm going to have to stop you there because we only have a couple of minutes until our next speaker. Thank you so much for such a comprehensive overview of the research on this topic. And it was really nice to hear you talk a little bit about the use of L1, the cross-curricular content, similarities with using the mother tongue. And so thank you so much for your talk. It was great to have you. We have a 2-minute break now. We have the next talk starting at in 3 minutes, so at 22. So grab a coffee and then be back here. Thank you very much.